Yeah, seriously. Fucked up.
All right, welcome everybody to preview week for Willamette, the Pinot Noir auction. The wines featured in this tasting series are small lot bottlings for our exclusive trade auction. Contact Emily at the WVWA, and I will put her email address in the chat if you don't know about the auction and you'd like to learn more. For this year's auction, we're pleased to announce a charitable partnership with the James Beard Foundation's Food and Beverage Investment Fund for Black and Indigenous Americans as part of their Open for Good campaign. All funds raised at auction lots beyond the opening bids, as well as through the paddle raise pledge, will go to that investment fund, and I will drop their website in the chat as well. I also want to take a moment to thank our sponsors of the auction for their ongoing support. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Featuring lot 15, we have Liz Kelly-Campanale of Lachini Vineyards. Presenting lot 16, Thomas Houseman of Amie Vineyards. Presenting lot 17, Chris Bertsche of Coelho Winery. And featuring lot 18, Dave Petterson from Domaine de Broglie. And our host, Eugenia Keegan of Jackson Family Wines, will kick it off. Eugenia, they're all yours.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for the introduction and good afternoon. It should be afternoon now for everybody. This is the third virtual tasting of the day. We have 3 each day this week, so 15 in total. And when we started at 9 o'clock, it was great for the New Yorkers. It was a little brisk in the morning for 9, but it's been very interesting, and that makes it all very interesting. So just as a note, the winemakers do change in every one of these broadcasts, so you'll get a different group every time. So let's get started. I do want to just comment again about our new partnership for this year with James Beard House. They do routine funds, and they started this new fund recently, and coincidentally, we are one of the first givers, but they have directed this fund towards DEI and will be supporting Black and Indigenous businesses in the food and wine industry in the form of grants. So we're very excited to be participating in this. And with that, we're going to get started. The first auction lot here is number 15 with Lachini. And Liz, take it away, will you?
All right. Well, thank you so much, Eugenia and Julia, for having us. This is the premier cuvee. We wanted to create a wine that was really showcasing the best of our vineyard for the auction. 2018 is a vintage. We found that we got a lot of structure out of our vineyard, but this wine does tend to be a little bit more fruit forward. It was aged about a year before we bottled it. November, a lot of red fruit. You'll get a little bit of the spice coming in underneath as well, but it's a really enjoyable wine that's going to be really nice to drink now, but will also age for 5 to 10 years.
Beautiful. 18 vintage for you?
Yeah, the 18 vintage. I mean, we, like I was saying, we got a good amount of structure out of the wines. I find that they tend to be a little bit more ageable than in some vintages. They are going to be wines that some of the wines we made at least need to lay down a little bit. Like I mentioned, this particular bottling is a little bit more approachable younger.
Yeah, well, of course, we know people are going to be tasting them for the auction, and I think that's certainly in our thinking when we're blending these wines. And I'm assuming your fanciful name, Premier Cuvée, is because it's your first opportunity to join us at the auction?
Absolutely.
Great, great. Thank you, Liz. That's just delightful. Lot 16, Amie Vineyards. And Thomas, tell us a little bit about 18 for you and this cuvee, and of course the name.
Okay, well, nobody really wants to look at my face, so I'm gonna show you some
Just
pictures.
put your mask on, dude.
I'm in the tasting room, so it may just happen. Anyway, share some pictures quickly. Here we go. So behind me I'm in the winery at the top of the hill, but this wine doesn't come from there, which is kind of the fun part about it. It's from the 12 Oaks Estate, which is on Chehalem Mountain, not here with the palm tree behind me. I want to talk a little bit about the 18 vintage. As Eugenia said, it's kind of interesting because I was looking back. I hadn't really thought about it, but what I remember from the 18 vintage was we started out with a lot of smoke. Does anybody remember all the smoke we had? And yet all the wines didn't have any, like we didn't have any smoke taint, but it made for these really spectacular sunrises. So this is the 12 Oaks Estate where this wine is from. I do remember, I mean, it was picture perfect clusters that year, really dry. And we had a lot of hang time. And therefore, as Liz said, we ended up with a lot of structure. The thing that I wanted to point out, the Musini clone that I'm bringing is a really interesting clone. It's a suitcase clone that Gary Andrus smuggled over, I think, in the 90s. But these are the actual clusters. It actually has 2 wings for the most part and no center cluster. So you end up with these like crazy cowboy mustaches, which is the weirdest thing I've ever seen, but it has this really incredible quality. This is the morning we picked it. We ends up having great acidity. It ends up having a lot of tannins, but it also has this really beautiful feminine quality that we don't get in a lot of our other Dijon clones. So it's one of those things that I like to showcase it because it's just such a very different expression of Pinot Noir than we get anywhere else. What I really love about the 18s, I think it's one of the best vintages I've seen in Oregon, hands down. It reminds me a lot of 2008. Because you ended up getting this really, really long hang time without any worry of pressure from disease. So you're able to just kind of let it ripen until the leaves changed, and you were getting all this really wonderful physiological ripening. So there you go. I'm done sharing my screen, and I'm back.
So, Thomas, the wine might be structured, but clearly you and your staff are not.
We totally aren't, Eugenia. Do I look like Rollin Souls, by the way?
Yeah, but you don't talk like Rollin. You got to work on that accent, dude.
I'm fixing to come after you, Eugenia.
There you go. Now,
that was actually great.
Much closer to Rollin. We had a question in the chat box. What clone is this wine or clones?
So once again, it's not a clone, it's a selection. So as I said, it's what I think the clones or selections that I really gravitate toward at the winery. I love the Coelho clone, I love this Musini selection, and I love 828. And they were all smuggled into the United States by one person or another. 828 and Musini by Gary Andrus. And I have to say that there's just something about these suitcase clones they're just so unique and so different, because I think we're all used to what we get from Dijon clones. We know what to expect. They're predictable. I think that's the great thing about them. But I think that there's something really nice about these suitcase clones that give you a completely different view of Pinot, a different voice.
So we call that faux 828.
Yes.
Yes, recognizing that the real 828 didn't arrive until 2012.
Exactly.
But it is a really interesting clone. No question about it. Thomas, thank you very much. Moving on to lot 17, Coelho Winery, and I see Chris. I also saw Dave poke his head in a minute ago. Maybe he'll join us for a word. Hi, Dave. Hi. Nice to see you. Thank you. Chris, Erratic Rock. Oh, I love this. I love this. I actually have a photo on Erratic Rock. I had to go out there because we use that term with Grand Moraine where we have no moraines, but we still use the term. But that rock is fabulous. Thank you. Go ahead, Chris. Tell us about lot 17, please.
Well, like you said, this is from our Delphina Vineyard, which is essentially right below Erratic Rock. So if you're ever in Oregon and you like to go to an actual state park, it's right above the vineyard. You can sit on the rock, look down the vineyard, look over to Amie, to the winery. But this wine we made here is fairly unique because we have 667 right below the rock right there, and the soil is so thin, and these vines just struggle. And as a winemaker, you love it because you get these little baseball clusters, and especially with the clone 667, you have real thick skins, a lot of juice to skin ratio, so you make these real concentrated wines. And of course, as a winemaker, we love it, but Dave kind of doesn't like it because
yeah. I heard small clusters. I hear small yields.
And our vineyard manager Roberto, like he went through and picked, you know, because they're kind of like big long rows, and as the hill goes up, you know, about half of the row is actually kind of on the slope with real thin soil. So he takes all his time and just picks those vines right there. So he has to pick the top, drive back down to the bottom, drive back to the top. So it's kind of a labor of love. And what we found making it in previous vintages, like in 17, that if you destem it, you just have so much structure, it's almost overbearing. So we try to do with this year's to try to kind of soften it up naturally by doing a whole cluster ferment. But I would say from a lot of people in the valley, when they do their whole cluster, you know, they do it like, you know, in your plastic tea bins, but we actually have a tank where we can bolt the lid down, so we can actually do like true carbonic lid bolted down whole cluster. So we pop the lid off maybe 2 times during the whole ferment, stomp it down, put the lid back on, and just whenever it tastes great, that nice, fresh, real fruity kind of bubblegum thing that you get from whole cluster here in Oregon. That's when we press it and we put it straight into like 500-liter barrel, and that's it.
That's really neat. Yeah. So is the erratic rock? How close is it to the vineyard?
Literally maybe 25 yards away.
Yeah. Oh wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the one big rock that rolled down from the Missoula floods and landed in our neighborhood. Yeah,
and we love that vineyard too because, you know, here in Oregon, you know, we love our dirt and how it got there. So I mean, that rock really has, you know, a true story coming down from the Missoula floods, and it's probably one of the unique landmarks of the Willamette Valley that, you know, you could actually go there, sit on it, you know, I don't know if you have a glass of wine there, but you could. But you know,
some of us have.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just a very unique site, and we're proud to, you know, own that property and get fruit from there and make these awesome wines out of it.
That's great. And how far west are you? Is this is this McMinnville?
Yes, exactly. So we're about, I would say, half mile away from Yamhill Valley Vineyards, and Mesara backs up about another half mile. So we're right off of 18. Yeah, and then probably like 2 miles away from Highland and Britain.
Yeah, we don't have many McMinnville selections this year, so that's really great. Thank you very much for contributing that.
No problem.
Next up is Dave Petterson, and Dave is with one of our newest, since I come from, since I work for a California company, I can sort of make these little pokes. So it is working with the Francis Coppola Winery, and the new one, correctly, the GLI in Italian is one of those very, very difficult things to pronounce if you weren't born pronouncing that. But Dave has been here for ages, and the winery was previously called Vista Hills, and he was the winemaker and manager there. So Dave is not new to the neighborhood, and he works with, I've made wine for 2 years from that vineyard, Vista Hills, and wow, it is absolutely a fantastic vineyard, and you must love continuing to work with it. So Dave, tell us about your lot 18, please.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Nice to connect with everyone. This is a pretty fun wine. So the majority of our winemaking nowadays is all single clone, single block designated wines, which is really interesting. I can, you know, after years and years of making Pinot Noir, I continue to be amazed by the diversity and variety you can get from a single vineyard and a single vintage, just block by block, clone by clone. So it's pretty amazing, and that's part of the fun of the whole Pinot Noir thing, right? Especially in Oregon. So as a winemaker, one of the ironies of making wine like that is you don't do as much, right? You just make the wine, let it be itself, let it come out how it comes out. So this particular wine's a rare opportunity for me to do a little blending. So I got to put together 2 of my favorite blocks. We have a block of Pomard clone stuff that's at the lowest elevation spot in the vineyard. It's kind of a swale where the soil's a little deeper, super vigorous, like a place where the vines just want to blow up with green tissue, and we have to do a lot of leaf pulling and a lot of hedging, and so it's really an area of the vineyard we need to contain the vigor. And then, so that's the Pommard. The 777 clone stuff is the very highest elevation spot in the vineyard, and it's a much more thin soil, top of the hill site, so smaller clusters, higher percentage of skin material, more anthocyanin, more polyphenol, everything. So a block that wants to produce real gritty, earthy kind of wine. So to me, like, yeah, no brainer. Let's blend these guys. Let's bring some fruit punch in the front, and let's have some of that beautiful, spicy black fruit finish and mid palate. And so I haven't actually had this wine since I blended it until just this week, and I really like it. It was exciting to try it, and really good, really fun. And it's really fun to be coming to an event like this for the first time with the Coppola company. They're really interested in getting more involved in stuff like this. They're proceeding slowly, as newcomers to the scene, so that's good. It's a shame we didn't get to do the live big thing, because we were really looking forward to getting to show the wine to everybody in person, but that time will come. I mean, the vintage was fantastic. I agree. Was it Thomas who said that this is one of the best? Yeah, I think it was Thomas. I agree. 2018 was the best vintages of my career, no doubt. Like, just beautiful hang conditions, and it was a hot year. Like climatologically, I think it was the second hottest year ever here. You'd expect really overripe, overdone, like low acid kind of overmade wine. It just didn't happen, and I can't explain why. Like, the wines retained some acidity, they retained some balance, which meant we could pick whenever we wanted. I mean, it's such a gift, especially at high elevation like we are. We're up at almost 1,000 feet there. So really a special vintage, delight to work with. So yeah, all the wines in 2018 we're really excited about, but honestly, this is possibly my favorite of the whole vintage.
Well, I'm sure glad it turned out that way, since the catalog work had already been submitted. So yeah, good thing it was the wine you wanted in the end, or you would have been doing some double footwork here, trying to explain it all. It's interesting talking about the 18 vintage and the warmth. It really depends a lot about when the heat comes. Is it spring? Is it summer? If it's July and we have 95-degree days, the vines don't really care. They're smarter than we are. They know how to shut down and stop working when it gets too hot. When it's too hot, the clusters don't like it, but in this time of the year, it's irrelevant. But in September, when we're trying to ripen, if it's 95 degrees out, which is literally unheard of in Oregon, but when it gets even 85 degrees, it's very warm for ripening. And one of the beauties is that September tends to be about 75 degrees on an average, and it allows for this much cooler season while we're ripening. It allows for all the fresh fruit and the acid. And I think if I've heard anything on all these calls today, it's how beautifully the acid hung on in 18, and how little work we winemakers had to do in the end, because the Mother Nature just really handed it to you. I know the sorting line was lonely and empty, and it was just one of those years. And it was part of, when we were talking about how to deal with the auction this year, one of the reasons we were so sad and disappointed to not have something is this vintage. It was like, we can't not share this vintage with the public. It's just too absolutely brilliant. And Dave, you said it. It could be your career vintage. So it's pretty exciting. Julia, what kind of questions are we having in the chat room today?
We got some really juicy ones in the registration. Folks, you're welcome if you have additional questions to pop them into the chat, but I think we should get started with some of these ones from just the signups. Here's a good one here. So in the last few years, how do you think the consumer palate has changed, if at all? And do you see that changing in the next few years?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Do you have a couple hours so we can really have this conversation?
A summit.
Let's do the summary part of this. Who'd like to step in and take an answer with that? Thomas, you work a lot with customers.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I'm thinking back. So my very first harvest at Amie was 2007. And I remember bringing, you step in as a new winemaker and you're given a vintage, which the critics at that point panned it before it was ever released, like before we'd even had a chance to put it in bottle.
Right.
And I was stepping out for my very first time, at Amie, and I was thinking, okay, great. I haven't even bottled this yet and it's been panned. And it turned out, in the end to be a really great vintage. Not necessarily an easy one to sell. But I remember being at my first Pinot camp, and we created that year a seminar, which has now been called, Multiple Personalities of Pinot Noir, where you're comparing different, vintages and different styles. And I remember my fellow panelists in 2007 called my wine in front of all these people that came to Pinot Camp shrill. Which is not necessarily, like, I could, somebody grab that out of my back, right? But you have to think that in 2007, we were coming off of, a lot of really ripe vintages and a very much bigger, richer, more kind of critic-oriented, barrel-centric, alcoholic, points-oriented style. And, now I look back, it's 13 years later and my wines are no longer shrill. They're not even like, I love to say that my wines have acid, and this is a perfect vintage. I mean, the finished pH on this is 3.48 without even trying, but I'm guessing that the 2007 was probably 3.55. So it had a higher pH, probably about the same alcohol, 13.5. But the difference is when you were standing in 2007 with a wine like that didn't have a lot of oak and wasn't just like a showstopper, it stood out. And now I'm kind of middle of the pack. So I like where it's gone. Personally, I like that we're no longer creating wines to, in my opinion, to please critics and get scores, that we're making wines, I think, for people, because the way that people shop for wines has changed and the way they talk about wines has changed. And I'm definitely on board with where it's going. Did I answer the question?
I think people are a lot less afraid of acid too. I mean, I think you see that in both red wines and white wines. I mean, look at the popularity of rosé and the style of rosés that have really boomed over the last few years. And you're looking at wines that have a lot more acid than you were seeing 10 years ago. And I think that you're seeing that in Pinot Noir as well. People actually are interested in cooler vintages and they don't just want wines that are going to be more fruit forward.
Well, I think the beautiful thing about having a computer in your pocket is you're no longer having to worry about somebody telling you, what you need to think about buying a wine. Like, you can trust your friends and your family and people on Instagram or whatever. And I think that there's a very different way of looking for wine and shopping for wine. And, think about what was the influence of sommeliers in 2007 versus now. And I think that there's a culture of that as well. And, they're searching out wines that are more food friendly and more, esoteric and interesting. And it isn't like there's just two people controlling, the voice of what wine styles are, which is, I think, wonderful and refreshing.
Yeah, you make a really great point about the gatekeepers, as we like to call them. Their palates have evolved a great deal. And to Liz's comment about acid, I think they're not afraid of it. I think they're really looking for it now and really enjoy that cleanliness and slightly lower alcohols, mostly because you get to drink more that way, or get to drink more and not be quite as far over that edge. And I think that I think we've seen a shift in the way we eat as well. And all of that those are all going hand in hand. We certainly are seeing Oregon wine sales exploding, and that's been a real positive. I think that over the last 5 years, every year it's gone up sort of in the double digits, which is not what the industry is doing and not what all other regions are doing. So I think there's been a really strong acceptance to the wines. And I like to think of it as that combination of of acid and structure and cleanliness, but we still are on the West Coast and it still gets reasonably warm here. And so they're packed with a lot of fruit, a lot of fresh fruit, not jammy fruit. So, but the next 5 years, this is a really interesting question. And we've touched on how people buy wine. And if we've noticed anything in the last 6 months, it's the move to electronic buying and internet buying. And if I had any wish out of COVID for the wine industry, it would be to break down all these ridiculous shipping laws and let us ship our wines just like a box of books, and not have to go beyond that. But it would open up the market for us, and of course it would give our consumers so much more diversity and opportunity to buy, not just from us, but from everybody. But what do we think will be happening in the next 5 to 10 years? That's a really good question. Dave, you have any thoughts on that? Where do you think your consumer's going?
I think that I don't really have the data to support this off the top of my head. I feel like the price of Oregon wine is coming more into line with the industry. Like, I feel like Oregon wines were really expensive 10 years ago, and I think they still are. I think on average we're still significantly above the national average. I mean, way above in bottle prices, but it's not crazy anymore. It felt crazy to me when I was younger, that everything good was $40 or $50, and there's so much more good, affordable Oregon wine out there, which I think actually helps all of us. I think it helps the expensive wines as well. I'm glad to see that, honestly. I mean, most of the wines we make are pretty high end and pretty expensive, but I'm always delighted to find like a really good Oregon Pinot Noir that retails for $25. They're out there now. They didn't used to be. Like, that used to be really hard to find. I think that's helping. Yeah, I think that I totally agree that it seems like consumers are getting a little bit, I don't want to say smarter, but more like educated about things like acidity, like Liz was saying, a little bit less beguiled by like these easy sort of monotonous wines that kind of dominated the market. I definitely feel like I see that happening. Tasting room business continues to thrive here, even in crazy COVID times. I mean, we're having really interesting conversations with, appointment groups and stuff, and it's changed the dynamic a lot, but it's brought in a more qualified audience in a lot of ways, and just people that are more likely to join our club and more likely to buy the wines. And, that's been happening for as long as I've been in the business. I feel like the consumer base has been getting better and more educated, but I see that continuing.
Yeah, I think, more educated, more adventuresome. I think we're seeing all of that. And I know that years ago, one of the things we would hear from consumers all the time is, we would love to drink your wines, but we can never find them. And we all know that with small production and reasonably expensive wines, it's hard to get three-tier distribution. And I think that the advent of these lesser expensive wines that are more like 20 to 30, there's much broader distribution, and to your point, David, it gets our name out there, not our brand name, but it gets our regional name out there all the time, and that's certainly a start. Any other comments on consumer palates?
Go ahead, Liz.
I would just say one thing, which is I think there's also been a huge interest in quote unquote natural winemaking. I think that's been a huge trend that we've seen. People are actually interested in how the wine is made. They actually want to know about, like, are you farming organically or biodynamically? Are you which additives are you using? Are you using yeast? Are you using native fermentations? It's interesting that we're getting so much more from the consumers asking us about those methods.
Yeah, there is. I think that we see that in food, and there's a certain portion of our population that actually cares about what they're putting in their body, which is, and I know, I mean, I drink my own wines. I know you all do. So obviously the not just the quality of them, but the purity of them is very important, because we're drinking these ourselves. So it's kind of one of those self-inflicted wounds if we do it wrong. Julia, what else is in our chat box today?
I actually have a question, if that's okay.
We wouldn't know that it was from you if you wanted to.
In a previous session, someone asked about crop load, and my question for the winemakers in front of me is, what was first of all, you can share what your crop load was like in 2018, but my question is really, how much do you see yield change from vintage to vintage in your site? And I think the customer and certainly the media have misconceptions sometimes about yield, that, you know, it's always the smaller the better, no matter what other, and we of course know that there are many factors present. What would you say is the variation in yield, and kind of what is your take on that sort of public, you know, myth, I guess?
Chris, you really willing to start this one off?
Sure, I'll take that grenade.
Thanks. It's hot, baby. It's hot.
I would say our yields for our Coelho estates, and we have 3 of them: Meekerville, Yale Amity Hills, and Van Duzer Corridor. I mean, I would say maybe we're off like 1/2 to 3/4 ton a year, but it really depends on, you know, kind of our demand for our, you know, our product is how we determine our yields. But generally we're 4.5 to 5. You know, certain blocks we carry heavier, like our rosé blocks, we're 6, 7. I mean, whatever the vine will produce. I mean, we don't cut shoulders, wings, anything like that, because if it's going to rosé, it's going to the press. So it doesn't really matter. But, you know, our finer wines are single vineyards. I mean, we might cut shoulders, but, you know, if the plant wants to yield 2 clusters of shoot, well, that's what Mother Nature gave us that year, and we'll kind of work with that. So that's kind of our philosophy. But I would say we are above the quote unquote stated average.
It's very French of you. The French take whatever Mother Nature gives them. So one year they make 1,000 cases, and the next year they make 4,000 cases. Yeah, and they wonder why their distributors are confused. But it is very interesting that is, you know, we farm, you know, we're so fastidious about some of that farming, and yet you go around the world and, you know, they're like, well, whatever's out there is what we take.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, I wouldn't say being on the production side, we're not going to cut off fruit, for sure.
If you say that out loud to the people that I work for, I will never forgive you. They walk down the rows and they see that fruit on the ground, and they're crying. They're literally crying. And like, do you have to do this? And we're like, yeah, we do.
Yeah, you really have to. But I think it depends how you farm your vineyard as well. So I think we kind of transitioned from a lot of, you know, crop berry management to more canopy management. Mm-hmm. So in the sense of, rather than hedging it 3 or 4 times, we're spending more time taking out laterals, and we're really managing the leaves we have. So we shoot for, you know, 15 to 20 leaves a shoot, 2 clusters. So rather than hedging and things like that, we tell our crew to, you know, if you see a lateral, take it out. Mm-hmm. So I think that's how we're, you know, kind of modulating some of our crop load and trying to get it ripe all at the same time, because Pinot Noir in Oregon, it just grows like a weed. I mean, you could hedge 4 or 5 times if you really wanted to.
Yeah, yeah. If you wanted to look like a neat little garden, yeah, you can be out there quite a bit. How about with climate change? Have you, Chris, and the rest of you seen yields going up a little bit as we try and accommodate, beat the heat a little bit?
Yeah. I think we're seeing like more shoulders and wings and stuff like that on the clusters for sure. Maybe some thirds here and there, but like I say, if that's what Mother Nature wants to give us, we'll take it. We'll just make more rosé.
No wonder she's so benevolent to you guys. Julia, does that answer your question? You want to hear from?
It does. Did anyone else want to add anything before I move on?
Well, I would like to say that I think what we've done. Well, first of all, I think the biggest thing that we need to talk about is the fact that the winters aren't as cold. So and the falls are longer, so that the vines are storing more carbohydrates before they go dormant. So we've always thought, you know, like in the past, when you have a really heavy year, we're like, oh, well, the vine's exhausted itself, and we're going to have a really light year next year. And I think what we're finding is in these warmer years that we're picking, and there's still leaves on the plant, and the plant, it doesn't get a cold freeze until later. So the roots are still pulling up energy. And then you're like, okay, this is going to be the year that we don't get a heavy load, and we get another one. And I think that that's probably what we're seeing more from climate change, is that they're not going dormant as early. So we're getting consistently large yields every year. So what we've been doing, going back to some of these, we're looking not only at clones like Mucineo that doesn't really give you a big, a big center cluster, but we're looking at things like was it 945, clone 945, which gives you 943. Thank you. Which gives you a smaller set, a lot of hens and chicks. So, we're trying to say, okay, well, if we're just going to try to manage by putting in clones that don't deliver you a whole lot of fruit, so that we're looking at it a little differently, rather than clones that I think a lot of these production clones give you large clusters and give you them consistently. So maybe you work backwards from there and try to do something different where you're getting the vine to give you less fruit.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about the Dijon clones and facilitating earlier ripening and rootstock RG and things like that, which of course, even 10 years ago were smart decisions, and now boom, we've moved over to. We're not worried about really early ripening anymore. It's not really the same thing that we were looking at a chart that Adelsheim does, and it's every year, and it's bud break, it goes through all of the steps. And when you look at their old charts, they didn't start picking till the 3rd, 5th, 7th of October. They didn't do anything until October. There was not even any picking in a hot year. They started picking on September 27th or something like that. So it's really shifted.
This is why we have RG. This is why we have things planted on Riperia, and this is why we have Dijon clones. They developed them in the 80s and 90s so that we would get fruit riper and we'd get consistent yields and we would get bigger yields. And I think that we were talking about what would things be like 10, 15, 5, 10 years, but I think if we look 20 years down the line, I think we're going to be looking at a whole new set of clones being planted, which are later ripening clones that are that are trying to get us back in that October window. And I think that we're going to be looking really hard at rootstocks and sites that are higher elevation sites and rootstocks that push things back a week to 2 weeks to try to get us in that window where we aren't picking in August and September.
That, or we'll all be planting Syrah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We'll be in Cap Franc. We were talking about that earlier. Yeah, I think that, I think most people would agree that the best place to start this exercise is in the vineyard. It obviously takes a long time because it's in the vineyard, but that is one of the best places to manage the weather. It also is harder to turn on a dime because it takes a long time to make changes in the vineyard, unless you just ridiculously pull things out, and then you never have the beauty of old vines. So it will be interesting as we shift. You mentioned something, Thomas, that was, I think, important. This came up earlier, and traditionally in Oregon, we have not planted above 800 feet, 750, 800 feet or so, and never, ever, ever on a north-facing slope. And we're starting to see both of those rules get broken, and we're moving up to 1,000 feet, particularly if you're making Chardonnay or sparkling, 1,100 feet, and people are just starting to head over the knoll a little bit and start planting on the crest and down a little bit on north-facing slopes. So I think we'll see that as maybe an interim move as we then replant some of the stuff that's been coming in, starting to come in a little early.
Well, I think the elephant in the room is what's going to happen in the fall, because I think that we're starting to see that the weather patterns are changing, and I think that I think that, like, for me, my picking decisions have always been based on that weather event. That when you start, we're all watching the weather, and we see that there's that rain event that just doesn't end until April. And I think that we might start seeing them earlier. Like we have a couple of times in the last couple of years. And I think that that's the other thing. It's like, sure, we can move to a higher elevation site and get cooler, but if the rains start coming to us earlier and we start getting rain events that are like we've seen a lot, these kind of warm rain events that come in early and they're more dramatic, then that's another conversation altogether. It's like, that doesn't help us at all if we're getting these.
No, it doesn't help us at all. It just increases disease pressure because the grapes are so far away from getting ripe. It's not an easy question, but then that's why we're farmers.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the other side of it too that's kind of related is, Thomas, you were talking about the smoke we saw at the beginning of 2018 and in 2017 where there were all the fires in Washington and in the Columbia Gorge. I mean, we're starting to see more fire pressure as well. I mean, you're talking about smoke taint, and you're talking about issues of trying to mitigate damage from wildfires. So I think that that's going to be another part that's also tied into that global warming side of it in terms of timing harvest.
And it's a valley. When it fills with smoke, it fills with smoke.
Yeah, well, and with smoke taint, the time it's concerning is when it happens right around when you're picking, and so that's
Yeah, they don't have wildfires in February, do they? When they don't affect us. Yeah. Yeah. Other thoughts, Julia? What's next?
Yeah, a good question from the registration. So the registrant is speaking as an independent retailer, but I'd be curious to hear this question answered in terms of other channels as well. What is our role in helping to spread the gospel of Pinot? As retailers, as restaurant buyers, what would you ask of them? Or
and do you think of that as the gospel of Pinot versus other red varieties? Where do you think the comparative part of that question is?
The questioner also had questions about differentiating Oregon Pinot Noir from other types of Pinot. So I think that's in particular where he was going.
So how would we like retailers to help us basically promote Willamette Valley Pinot? Is that?
Yeah, I think that's about it.
Yeah. Dave, you got some ideas there? That's toughy.
I do, actually. No, I don't find that one tough because I've thought about this a lot.
Good.
Consumers, by our nature, all of us, right? When we buy a product and we spend a lot of money on it, we want to know what we're getting. We want to kind of in advance. We want to read the reviews and we want to expect it. Well, that's not the way Oregon Pinot works at all. Oregon Pinot is diverse. It's different every time. It's ever changing. It's maddening, right? And I think that's the message that that resellers can help us with, is like, it's kind of about adventure and experimentation and learning. Like every time you buy a bottle, because you bought a bottle of 2000 Thomas's 7 Amie, don't expect the 2009 to taste like that. Don't expect the 2012 to taste like that. It's not going to. It's going to be a different creature. And that's the gospel, I think, that I spread all the time. It's like, this is the fun. This is the point of what we're doing. Like, it's different every time. Like, this is not brewing beer. We're not dialing in a recipe for IPA. It's the same thing every time. It's the opposite of that. And so that's, and I get it. Like, I understand why, especially for something expensive, like that can be confounding for a buyer. That's the message I think that people can spread. This is fun. It's interesting. It's learning.
Yeah, we sell products quite differently than that. McDonald's is a perfect example where it's supposed to be exactly the same bite of food, no matter where you have it in the world, essentially. It's supposed to be the same. And to your point, Dave, that's exactly the opposite of what we do. And I like the idea that this is an important message for retailers to share, so that there isn't that obvious disappointment, that they know going into it that this bottle is going to taste differently than the last one. That is the beauty of it, as opposed to, well, it wasn't the same as the last one. Even if it's better, it's not the same. That's a really, that's a very distinguishing point. That's really great.
Well, and what we were talking about earlier with sort of the movement toward actually caring about the purity of the process and the wine, I think that that's another thing that Oregon does really well, is land stewardship and farming sustainably. So that's another side I think that they can use.
Yeah, I think that's because we live here. You know, we're all stewards of our own properties, and we live on them, and we grow food on them, and it's this whole universe of what we're eating and drinking. And it's one of the ethos that I love about working in the Willamette Valley, is everybody thinks that way. So, you know, about a month from now, the counter in the kitchen is just going to be just full of produce from everybody that they used to bring it by the winery. I don't know what we're going to do this year, but you know, you get all this wonderful produce, et cetera, that's all homegrown. Everybody's got their own gardens, and I think it's just a really important part of our ethos and lifestyle here.
Juliana, can I chime in? on one last thing on
You certainly may.
subject for the consumer market. From what I see with our consumers, I think there's a lot of confusion about Oregon because, you know, from what they hear about, like in magazines or ads, that, you know, it's like they think Oregon's like very sustainable and, you know, organic. But I would say like the general consumer, let's say, you know, the flyover state consumer, that example, but you know what I mean. They, I think they're confused by that because, like, what's the difference between, you know, being organic and sustainable and live certified and natural wine? I think there's a lot of confusion involved with Oregon Pinot and those kind of statements, because not all of us are, you know, we all try to be organic and sustainable, but we're not all natural wine. And I think some of the Oregon Pinot that gets pushed to the forefront has that kind of name tag attached to it. And I think that's what confuses a lot of consumers, broadly, generally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I'm going to join in for just a second. I'm going to summarize this. And I think that everybody has done a wonderful example of helping me with my story is, so for the past, I think 5 or 6 years, I've been moderating the technical symposium down at the World of Pinot Noir in California. And so it's a bunch of winemakers sitting down and showing their wines blind in a room and tasting them and trying to guess, you know, is it your wine? Where is it from? You know, why did it come here? You know, why did you bring this wine? And you know, what feedback do you want? And I remember one year I was sitting there, and there's always a group of Oregonians. There's more Californians. And it's been nice as an Oregonian to be able to kind of steer the conversation, you know, based on what I'm seeing from California. And I remember one of the California winemakers saying, you know, it's really interesting. You Oregon winemakers are really different than us. You are much more philosophically driven, and what we are much more commercially driven. And I didn't say that. It was, and it makes sense. I think that if you look at like all the comments that we've had, so much of it is about philosophy. It isn't necessarily who is wrong or right, but I think that we're at a scale, as you know, for most of us as family wineries, where we can make those decisions philosophically and find an audience for these wines. And when you're at a scale of a lot of the wineries in California, where they're much more corporately driven and they're much bigger, you're making decisions in a different way. I think that we're very fortunate to be a small industry and to be able to make philosophically driven wines. That's my take on it.
I agree 100%.
I do too, Thomas. It's really great. It really is something that differentiates us from other winemaking regions in particular.
Absolutely.
Really like that.
I have one more that was actually, it was asked in the last session, but I like it, so I'm going to ask again. Does farm to table include wine for you, and do you think consumers feel that way?
It's a really good question. Because I heard the last set of answers, I'm gonna not say anything here. And neither are the rest of you.
I don't want to take the lead on everything. I want to give somebody else a chance to step forward because I feel like I can go off. But it's interesting being out in the marketplace. I know how I feel, but I'm not going to be first.
Oh God, we do have to draw straws here.
Okay, I'll be first.
Go for it, Thomas.
I think it's really interesting because and you see this a lot. Farm to table is really amazing, and you go to a lot of these farm to table restaurants, and they'll give the exact name of the producer that made, that grew the parsley. It's a garnish on the plate, and the list is full of all these wonderful esoteric producers from Europe. And I think it's a really interesting conundrum where you can say that, that everything on this plate was sourced within, 15 miles of here, and there's not a regional wine on the list at all. And I'm not saying that it has to be from Oregon, but I think that there's a discussion to be made about, okay, great that this is a wonderful tiny producer that's making 500 cases in the south of France, but it's not necessarily, there's a divide that I think that somehow that people can make in their heads that isn't, and Portland's a perfect example. I think that the Portland retailers are just as guilty of this as everywhere else that I've ever been. And I don't know what to say about that. I think that there's a huge kind of schism that in how decisions are made.
Well, Thomas, I'll expand on that for you. I think it's an access question, and I think because Oregon is so small that there's not a lot of access in the consumer market, right? So you really have to position yourself within those areas to, sell your wine,
I do think if you look at the numbers, Oregon does a pretty good job of drinking our own wine. Like I think I think that we actually, Portland, yes, there are definitely going to be restaurants that aren't carrying a ton of Oregon producers, but a lot of them have a pretty good Oregon wine list. And I think that you do see, when you go to like retailers, when you go to like Fred Meyer or New Seasons or any of those, you see a ton of Oregon wines on the shelves. And so I think that there is a large demand for local wine. And I think that you're starting to see more of that. I think there's an interest in small producers. I think there's an interest in having those wines available, at least from the consumer side. I wonder how much it's just a matter of sort of education with restaurants, or talking to them and saying, hey, you're so local everywhere else, have you thought about doing this? Have you thought about doing some of these or featuring some of these places? But I think a lot of restaurants are moving in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I agree. For the most part there are, but I do think that there's a huge divide about how wine lists don't necessarily mirror the rest of the values of the restaurant.
Yeah. Even, we think about, again, Europe, you have regional wines. You don't go to Burgundy and drink Bordeaux. You don't have it. You don't even have a wine from the south of France when you're in Burgundy, or vice versa. And they eat regionally and they drink regionally. And we really haven't gotten there. Even we do make wine in all 50 states, but you don't. If you make wine in Michigan, I actually have 2 college friends that have wineries in Michigan, and they have to create a destination. They're at their winery, it's a destination with jazz on Friday and barbecues and all that, because outside of maybe Grand Rapids or Traverse City or that area where they are, not only can you not find their wines, but nobody wants to bring them in as distributors. It's like, well, we don't have a market for that. And but I think Chris makes a great point about access. And if we are small, we have a lot of D2C business, and we do have reasonably expensive, somewhat esoteric wines. And if they're not getting pushed out to those lists, then there's this whole gap in there. And America is such a big market that the rest of the world is coming to America to sell wine. And in some cases, they're kind of eating our lunch. Because they're much more assertive. They've got bigger marketing budgets, bigger sales budgets, and they know that America is the place to be selling wine. So we're competing with that all the time. And they have a little advantage. They've been doing it a little bit longer. And there's this automatic respect for the work that they do that sadly, I don't think we've quite earned yet, at least not everywhere. It's growing every day. And all you have to do is taste 25 wines out of the Willamette Valley, and if you don't think that's consistent quality, I don't know what you're tasting. Because that's
Eugenia, you make a really interesting point about cuisine. I wonder if some of what we run into is that we don't necessarily have that same regional cuisine. In France, for example, you have sort of regional cuisine that grew up in Burgundy around the wine that was available in Burgundy, and so that's going to be where you're finding really well-paired foods. But in the US, we don't sort of have that same legacy of regional cuisine, so you're not necessarily going to find food that is matching the local wine.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Liz. I wonder if what we're seeing, I think with COVID a little bit, that people are, for one reason, you just can't go very far, but I think we're seeing a little bit of a change, and all of the victory gardens, and sort of the idea that it makes a lot of sense to be growing your own food and eating what will, I mean, if you love tomatoes, you really wouldn't want to be farming in Oregon, because there's only, you know, two vintages every 10 years. You know, Thomas, you're a huge gardener, but we just don't always get tomatoes.
Tomato year in decades.
Yeah, I mean, a tomato year is like a big deal.
I'm just growing them because I like to watch them grow. I don't think that I'm actually going to get a tomato this year.
Yeah, well, then you won't be disappointed. That's the beauty of that philosophy.
No, I just like being out in the garden and go through the motions. But yeah, no tomatoes this year for me.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a comment in the chat room, by the way, about how France educates Psalms. And I think that's just an important statement in and of itself, where wine is, and just being a waiter. I mean, we all know that being a waiter is a profession. Here it's, you know, how to get beer money during college. So very different approach to food and wine, and who knows if we'll ever get there.
Well, and I think that my last thing is, I think that the farm to table movement is so new that we just need to, kind of like with wine in the Willamette Valley, I mean, we need to give it time to evolve and change and find its own identity and see where it goes. I think that, you know, it's like we're able to observe from the outside, but I think it's more important to watch how it grows and evolves from the inside. And God forbid, I mean, it's like, let's just hope that these establishments thrive once that people can get back into restaurants again. I mean, I just feel for everybody that's in the restaurant business right now.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah, well, and it's not a matter of doing anything. It's not a matter of working harder or working more hours or getting your friends to do stuff, or, you know, it's even getting money. It's none of that. It's, you simply can't open your doors. Yeah, it's.
I mean, we've all been so fortunate in Oregon that we've been deemed essential businesses and been able to go to work every single day. And granted, we've had to kind of reinvent what we do, but at least we've been able to go to work and been able to get behind what we do and what we're passionate about. Imagine being passionate about you being in a restaurant and your wine list and serving people and just not being able to do it.
I'm sure you've all read the stories. They tend to be in the New York Times, but the restaurateur, and I'm in tears by the time I'm at the end of the article, because their entire life just went poof. And it's not like, I mean, a fire as an example, which, you know, what could be worse than a fire, but at least there's something called rebuilding. You know, this is sort of limbo land, and we don't know when it'll change. And to your point, Thomas, let's go spend all our money in restaurants for 6 months.
Heck yeah. I mean, yes, we need to. I mean, I'm as guilty as everyone else. As you said, I'm a huge gardener and I love eating everything that I grow, but I can't lose sight of the fact that, you know, there are people out there that really need me to go and eat at their restaurant. Yeah.
Yeah. We're trying to, we're doing a lot of gift cards at our local restaurants for our interns. So they don't want to cook. I don't want them out socializing. So it's like, here, pick up good food at this restaurant and go home. By the way, there's a 6-pack of beer in the car too. You know, just, you know, just to help the restaurants and make sure we keep people contained.
Yeah, I think it just underscores the importance of the James Beard Fund as well, and how important it is to all of us.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. It really does. One of the things this particular fund is doing is they've, and correct me if I've got this wrong, but I think they've divided the country up into 16 regions, and then you start pushing the money out so that the regions get some sort of even distribution of funds rather than first come, first serve or anything like that. So I think it will be very exciting. Of course, we have to be able to open these restaurants and go to them to have these grants mean something besides just getting by from A to B. Yeah. I'm looking forward to harvest. We are having an absolutely stunning year out here so far. The vineyards don't seem to know that there's any issue whatsoever in the rest of the world, so they're just doing their thing. And so far, it's looking to be a very nice vintage, which we'll share with you in a couple of years, hopefully in person.
Cheers to that.
Cheers.
Julia, that's about wrapping it up for us?
I think so. I have put the links to learn more about the auction if you're not familiar in the chat. If you are trade, I have the link to register to bid if you've not already done so. We hope to see you on the 11th, 12th, and 13th next week. And yeah, thank you, everybody.
There will be a live close with Fritz Hatton on the last day of the auction. So you know Fritz, he'll bring a lot of liveliness to it all. So, I want to thank the panelists. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for your contribution to the auction and your great wines, and for sharing your thoughts with us. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Julie.
Cheers.
Thank you, Eugenia.
Pleasure.
Bye.